So, how to explain that? And, against what kind of background did the explanations take root? It's all very well having an explanation, but you need circumstances in which the explanation makes some kind of sense. First one was, I've already mentioned briefly, it was the failure of Arab nationalism to defeat and destroy and remove the state of Israel. And along with the two Israeli wars, that of 1967 and the October War 6 years later, there came an oil embargo by the Gulf states. And that oil embargo suddenly made it appear that Arab nations of the Middle East had real power both in the world of international politics and also in the Muslim world's popular imagination. Many Muslims believed, with Saudi Prince Saud al-Faisal, that the hundreds of billions of dollars of wealth obtained from the Persian Gulf's huge oil deposits were nothing less than a gift from God. Now this new wealth was used by a second enabling factor, that of the funding by the Saudi state of what might be called investment in petro-Islam. Throughout the Muslim world, religious institutions for people both young and old, from madrasas to the very high level scholarships, received Saudi funding. More than 1,500 mosques were built with money obtained from public Saudi funds, along with training for the preachers and teachers who went on to teach and work at these universities, schools and mosques. And the funding was also used to reward journalists and academics who followed the Saudis' strict interpretation of Islam. The interpretation of Islam promoted by Saudi petrodollars was the strict, conservative, Saudi-based Wahhabism or Salafism, which taught that Muslims should reject absolutely any non-Muslim ideas and practices, especially political ones. And while this effort has failed to convert all or even most Muslims to the Wahhabist interpretation of Islam, it has done much to overwhelm more moderate local interpretations and has set the Saudi interpretation of Islam as the gold standard of religion to Muslims' minds. The third factor enabling the resurgence of Islam and Islamist ideas was the general dissatisfaction with the status quo. Paradoxically, the centre of this great munificence has in fact been afflicted by economic stagnation. For example, it's been estimated that the exports of Finland, a European country of 5 million, exceeded those of the entire 260 million strong Arab world if you exclude oil revenue. New schools and universities turned out students well versed in the Quran, but unfitted to solving the problems thrown up by the destructive wake of modernization. Strong population growth with economic stagnation has created urban conglomerates in cities like Cairo, Istanbul, Tehran, Karachi, Dakar, Jakarta and so on, each with well over 12 million citizens, millions of them young and unemployed or underemployed. Alienated from the Western ways of the urban elites and uprooted from the comfort of more passive traditions of the villages they appear to be easy converts to an Islamic system promising a better world and an ideology which provides group identity and solidarity of shared beliefs. Three more are mentioned because time is catching up with me. The collapse and disintegration of the Soviet Union and the consequent loss of an alternative model to follow, that had an effect. Defeat of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan seemed to give credence to the belief that by faith, strong Muslim faith alone, the forces of the great Satan could be defeated. This view, of course, the community forgets the fact that the Taliban and the fighters in Afghanistan were in fact trained and aided by the United States. And the final thing I want to mention is in fact the Iranian Revolution, and for the rest of the talk I'll go briefly through the recent history of Iran. Now you can look at Iran as a kind of laboratory experiment for the Islamic State. Iran abandoned the reform path and in favour of revolution from above, which reduces the role of the working class to that of political pawns who have little or no control over their destinies as individuals, or more importantly as a class. And even granting their major premise, that is, that they had God on their side, this revolution could not be made to work in the interests of the working class, which is something we could have told them at the time had they wished to listen. Persia is a state that has a very long history, going back to at least 500 BC. It's never colonized or subject to mandate rule. It's a multi-ethnic state. And in 1930, Shah Reza Khan Pahlavi changed its name from Persia to Iran and claimed that the Persians were the original Aryans. He was a reformer and a modernizer on the lines of Kemal Ataturk in Turkey. And the West's interest in Persia was, of course, the oil that's there. The British Navy had converted to oil power in 1912, but there was no oil in the British Empire, but there was plenty in the Middle East. And to exploit the oil deposits in Persia, there's a company formed called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Corporation, which was much more Anglo than Iranian. None of the board on the board of directors was in fact an Iranian. And Daniel Yergin, in his book The Prize, quotes one of the directors of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. When he was asked why aren't there any Iranians on the board, he says, "What? And let the natives see the books." Anyway, the Shah of Iran was deposed in 1941 by the British as being unreliable because he had pro-Axis sympathies, and Iran had